Alright, this is Jahangir from MedPorium, and today we have the final installment of the urinary system, which is part 6. Now, in part 6, we will discuss urine storage and elimination, including the anatomy of the bladder, urethra, ureter, and how it is eliminated through neural control. So let's start by the ureters. So the ureters transport urine from the renal pelvis to the bladder. To understand the anatomy of the ureters, let's go to the ThinkPad. Alright, so we're at the ThinkPad and we want to understand the anatomy of the ureters. Well, we first need to understand that the renal pelvis funnels urine into the ureters, in which the ureters take that urine and dump it into the bladder. So basically, the ureters are the transport vessel that take the urine that was developed by the kidneys and take it all the way to the bladder. So it'll be drained and excreted out of the body. Now there are three layers of the ureter. There's the adventitia, which is the outside layer right over here, and it is a connective tissue layer that is like the eggshell for the egg. It's kind of the protective layer, and it has veins, arteries, and nerves. So second, we have the muscularis, which is a layer of smooth muscle. Now, the muscularis operates by pushing or squeezing the urine out through the ureters. We'll talk about the muscularis and its functions later. Now, the third layer we have is the mucosa, which is a layer of the ureter that secretes mucus to minimize friction. So I have a picture on my left showing all the three layers. We have our mucosa, the muscularis, and finally the adventitia. So now let's talk about what happens when urine enters the ureters. Well, when urine does enter the ureters, the muscularis contracts, releasing a peristaltic wave, which is an involuntary muscle contraction similar to the waves of the ocean. So it would kind of look like this, kind of milking the urine out through the ureters. Now this peristaltic wave is seen all the way throughout the ureters until the ureters meet the bladder, which they also meet a small flap of mucosa that acts as a valve to prevent backflow of urine when the bladder contracts. So basically the valve would be somewhere over here, and it kind of controls the flow of urine so urine doesn't go back through the ureters. Alright, so we just wrapped up our discussion about the ureters from the ThinkPad. Now let's talk about the urinary bladder. And this is where urine is drained by the ureters and escapes through the urethra. To understand the urinary bladder and its anatomy, let's move on over to the ThinkPad. Alright, so we're at the ThinkPad and we want to understand the urinary bladder. Well, today we'll talk about the urinary bladder of both the female and the male. For now, let's focus on the female urinary bladder and its anatomy. Alright, so let's talk about the anatomy of the urinary bladder of the female. And we'll first start by the ureter. And as we talked about, the ureter transports urine from the renal pelvis all the way through the bladder. Now let's talk about the detrusor muscle, which is also known as the muscularis. Now, the bladder has the same layers as the ureters, as I talked about before. We have our adventitia, we have our muscularis, also known as the detrusor muscle, and we have our mucosa, which brings us to the urethral opening. And this is where the ureter enters through the bladder. So next we have the urethra. The urethra is a transporting vessel for the bladder and the urine so the urine can be excreted out of the body. There is a urogenital diaphragm. Next we have the external urethral orifice, which is basically the opening in which urine is excreted out. Now the external urethral orifice should not be confused with the external urethral sphincter. Now, the sphincter is a muscle in which is contracted that can hold urine from escaping. The external urethral sphincter is made of skeletal muscle in which we can have a voluntary control over it, meaning this is what controls our urine from going out. Finally, we have the internal urethral sphincter, which is made of smooth muscle, meaning we have an involuntary control of this. Just like the external urethral sphincter, it is a muscle that is enclosed kind of like a valve, but here we have an involuntary control over it, meaning we can't control this, we can't contract it, and that's due to, as I talked about, the smooth muscle that is composed of the internal urethral sphincter. And that concludes the urinary bladder anatomy of the female. Alright, so now let's talk about the anatomy of the urinary bladder of a male, and we'll start by the ureter. And as I talked about, this is a transport vessel from the renal pelvis to the bladder in transporting urine. Now, we haven't seen this in the female urinary bladder, and we didn't talk about this, and this is the rugae. And the rugae is just wrinkles in the bladder that allow for more expansion. Now, next we have the urethral openings. Now, I hope you guessed it now, because we have the trigon now. And as I talked about, the trigon kind of makes a triangle shape from the two urethral openings to the urethral mark. Now let's use some active recall, and I want you to guess where this arrow is pointing. So pause this video and try to guess where the arrow is pointing. Now, if you guessed the detrusor muscle, then you're right. And as I talked about, the detrusor muscle is the muscularis of the bladder. So to incorporate some more active recall, I want you to pause this video and guess where these three arrows are pointing to. Now, for the first arrow, you should have gotten the internal urethral sphincter. And as we talked about, the internal urethral sphincter is made of smooth muscle, meaning we have an involuntary control over the internal urethral sphincter. Now, the second arrow is pointing to the urogenital diaphragm. Now, the third and final arrow, we have the external urethral sphincter, which is made of skeletal muscle, which means we have a voluntary control, meaning we can control the external urethral sphincter. Alright, so we just wrapped up our conversation about the urinary bladder from the ThinkPad. Now let's talk about the urethra, and this is a vessel in which urine is excreted out from the body. To understand the urethra and its anatomy, let's move on over to the ThinkPad. Alright, so we're at the ThinkPad and we want to understand the urethra. We also want to talk about the other components of the male urinary bladder. So we'll first talk about the three regions of the urethra, which include the prostatic urethra, the membranous urethra, and finally the spongy penile urethra. And that is how urine is excreted throughout the urethra, starting from the prostatic urethra to the membranous urethra and all the way to the spongy urethra, in which it'll be excreted out through the external urethral orifice. Now, other components that make up the male urinary bladder include the penis, the bulbourethral gland, and the prostate gland. Urine flows through the prostate gland. Urine will always flow through the prostate gland. Now, something I didn't mention before is that the detrusor muscle is thickened near the urethra to form the internal urethral sphincter, which is composed of smooth muscle, as I talked about. So the detrusor muscle kind of gets thick over here to make the internal urethral sphincter, which, as I talked about, is kind of like the valve. Alright, so we just finished our conversation about the urethra from the ThinkPad. Now let's talk about voiding urine, and that's basically a fancy way to say to urinate. When the bladder is filling up with urine, the detrusor muscle must relax and the urethral sphincters must remain closed, which is done by the postganglionic fibers. Now, I just said a lot of medical jargon and you must be confused. Well, we'll talk about all of this stuff later in the ThinkPad. Now, main vocabulary to learn is the afferent signals, which we'll learn in the nervous system. And these are signals that tell your brain what they are sensing. There's also the efferent signals, which are signals sent by the brain to tell your body what to do. To understand voiding of urine and the neural control it has, let's go to the ThinkPad. Alright, so we're at the ThinkPad and we want to understand the nervous control over urination. Well, to do that, we need to understand some very crucial medical jargon, and we start by micturition, which is the act of urinating, just a fancy way to say act of urinating, and this is controlled partly by the micturition reflex, in which we will talk about today. The second medical jargon we need to understand is the sympathetic fibers, which issue a fight or flight response to danger. The third medical jargon we have is the parasympathetic fibers, which inhibit the body from overworking and restores to a calm state. And fourth, we have motor fibers, which is a nerve fiber whose stimulation causes muscular contraction. We will talk about the sympathetic fibers, the parasympathetic fibers, and the motor fibers once we get into our nervous system unit. So I have a picture on my left to understand the nervous control over urination. We'll start by involuntary micturition reflex. So the stretch receptors, which are just receptors on the bladder, detect the filling of the bladder and transmit an afferent signal to the spinal cord through the pelvic nerve, in which the spinal cord takes that information and returns an efferent signal from the parasympathetic fibers through the pelvic nerve. Now, this efferent signal, which is sent by the spinal cord via the parasympathetic fibers, excites the detrusor muscle. Now, the efferent signal also relaxes the internal urethral sphincter, in which urine will come all the way close to the external urethral sphincter. And this happens involuntarily, meaning the body just does this without our control. We can't control the internal urethral sphincter. But what we can control is the external urethral sphincter, in which we will talk about now. Alright, so now let's talk about voluntary control. And this is input from the stretch receptors, which ascend all the way to the nucleus of the pons into the micturition center. Now, the signal from the stretch receptors goes through the pons, in which the pons kind of set up a UN conference with the brain centers, asking them if it's timely for urination. If it is, then the pons return the signal to the spinal interferons that excite the detrusor and relax the internal urethral sphincter, also relaxing the external urethral sphincter, which in this case urine is voided. Now, if the brain centers say, no, it's not time for urination, then the cerebrum excites the spinal interferons that keep the external urethral sphincter contracted. So this is what we do when, let's say, we're at a conference and it's not timely to use the restroom. This is when we hold the external urethral sphincter. Now, this will cause a buildup or contraction of the detrusor, which raises pressure in the bladder, which equates to more excitation of the stretch receptors, which increases the urge to use the restroom. Now, when it is time to urinate from that long conference that you can finally use the restroom, the signals from the cerebrum stop the sacral neurons from firing that keep the external sphincter closed, in which the external urethral sphincter relaxes and the urine is voided, meaning urine goes out as the external urethral sphincter is relaxed. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the nervous control over urination. Alright, so that wraps up part 6, the final part of the urinary system. In part 6, we discuss urine storage and elimination, including the anatomy of the ureters, the urethra, and the bladder, and voiding of urine. And as always, a pomodoro a day makes you a doctor someday. I'll see you next time.